right. It is 6 o'clock.
It is 6:04.
Okay, I'll call the meeting to order. Say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I'll take minutes, notes.
Bless you. Need to. Okay. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll make a motion that we approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
I'll second that, and it's
Nick?
Data.
Okay, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep.
Do we have anybody joining us from the board?
Somebody
Okay, that's
texted
Dave.
about being late.
I know Lauren's not gonna make it, she's in Colorado still.
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting Chris Darby either.
No, he's
Oh,
on
Dave.
vacation. Chris is away, yep.
Is Dave on the camera? He said he texted me he was going to be a few minutes late
Okay.
for the meeting. So,
He is the call.
oh, he is. Oh, okay.
Well, we'll assume he voted to approve the agenda. If he didn't, he can let us know when we see him.
All right, right.
I just want to make sure we have a quorum.
Yeah, we do have a forum.
Okay, next we have Mr. Martin.
Hi, Carrie. Hi, Patrice. I'm excited tonight to be sitting at the big table, as I joked earlier. In actuality, I'm way more excited to be joined by Carrie and Patrice and to be here as a spectator and light participant in tonight's equity training for our board members. I have the honor of introducing Carrie and Patrice, who I've known now for several years through my work both in Portland and my previous district with the Connecticut Center for School Change, which is a nonprofit organization that helps districts improve board and school leadership practices with really, just an expert lens and drive towards improving equity. They're really the foremost experts in my mind in the area on the subject. They've been a tremendous asset to our work with forming and advancing our Equity and Inclusion Coalition in Portland, and I'm thrilled to have them on hand tonight to lend their expertise to our board members as we look to advance equity at every level of Portland Public Schools. So without further ado, Carrie and Patrice, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, board members. It's an honor to be here. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yep.
And I'm going to share the screen right off the bat because we know that time is a precious commodity, and we're gracious that we're able to be here with you. So just really quick, I'm going to go over I'm just going to pass the Zoom protocols because you're all in person, which is exciting. And I'm just going to reintroduce myself in the way that we typically do. My name is Carrie Lord. My racialized identity is Black biracial, and my pronouns are she, her, and I am here with my colleague.
Hello everyone, I'm Patrice Nelson. My racial identity is white, and my pronouns are also she, her.
Great. And one of the reasons that we introduce ourselves in this manner, of course, is because when we are engaging in equity work, we want to recognize that while we are all in the same storm, we are not in the same boats. And that's really this idea that because of our different identity, social identity group memberships, we do have different experiences as we walk through the world. And so we highlight that by talking about naming and normalizing talking about race by sharing our racialized identity. We say racialized, meaning that because race is a social construct, we've all been racialized, have a certain racial identity. And so these are the identities that we share with you today. And of course, a part of how we want to think about this work is think about the place in which we do this work. And so we like to open by starting with a land recognition. We want to recognize that the original keepers of the land, where you all are, we're members of the Wendat tribe. And while Patrice is in Simsbury and I'm in New Haven, we still want to honor the space that we take up. And this Indigenous protocol is a way of really expressing gratitude and appreciation for the land in which we reside. And we acknowledge the indigenous people who have been honoring and working the land before it was appropriated and stolen by European settlers. We want to recognize that the land acknowledgement does not exist in the past, that colonialism is still current, ongoing process, and to speak to implications of that still as things that we're still grappling with today in the modern society. And so we push this in not just to not just as a thing to do, but also as a way to help us think about the stories that we tell when we think about equity, who is present with us when we tell these stories, whose stories do we listen to, who gets to tell the story, and from what perspective. And so this is one of the ways that we bring our Indigenous voices into this space, because they are so frequently without voice in these spaces. And then, of course, we have some norms, some things that we say, hey, when we're going to do this work, we have some very specific norms that we like to propose to help us engage in meaningful and productive dialogue. And so typically, I have members of the community read these norms, and so I'm going to trust that you all know how to be together and take turns reading these aloud. And so if one person could start off, and then you could just go in a row, since I can't physically see you, if you could just go in a row and read these out loud, that would be fantastic. And so who's my brave starter?
Do you want to join?
Sure.
Hi, we've met several times now. I'm Charles Britton, the superintendent.
Thanks,
You
Charles.
got to read the
So you
first,
wanna-
read number 1.
So I will speak for myself and about myself.
Yeah, perfect. All right, who's next?
I'm Tim Lavoie. Our stories are personal and not up for debate. I will respect the stories that are told and respect the confidentiality.
Great, thanks. Tim, these should look familiar to you.
They are.
You could run this meeting, Tim.
I know.
Oh, yeah.
If I seem underwhelmed, it's just, yeah, we just did all this, but this is good refresher.
Excellent. All right. Tim, I don't know who's sitting next to you, but the next person, if you would read
Hi.
number 3, please.
Yep, I'm Laurel Steinhauser. Number 3 says, race and bias are on the table. I will talk about race.
Thank you so much, Laurel. Who's next?
I, Sharon Peters, lean into my discomfort. I will use my discomfort as an opportunity for self-reflection.
Thank you. Who's next?
I am Meg Scaba. Commit to keep the work going. I will accept non-closure and make a plan to keep the work going in whatever way I can.
Perfect. Thank you, Meg. And, that last one is really important because this is the first of 2 sessions. And, one of the things that Patrice and I, we talk about a lot in this work is that, so I know Eric said this is an equity training, and we always try to say it's less of a training and it's more of an opportunity to engage in conversation, to explore ideas around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what that really means in the context of the work that you're doing as a school board. So I'd like for you to think about this as an opportunity for you to just have some really great conversations about this. And maybe you will come away with a different way of looking at this work than you had before you stepped in the room. And again, to just say, why do we have these norms? We have these norms because it's really important to us that people feel they have the space, the opportunity to have conversation and invite multiple perspectives to the table without judgment, right? A big part of this work is to sort of level out the inequalities that we may have around information or issues or experience or power, and just say, hey, we are all in the same storm tonight, and so we're gonna weather the storm from our boat and float in this pond and see if we can stay dry, but have a good journey. And so this is why we have these storms. So tonight we are really just going to focus on what it means to be a board that governs for equity. We want you to be thinking about things like what do you have to consider and what is the mindset that's required to do. Our next session is really going to be focused on ways in which we can support the community and creating a shared understanding and partnering in this work. We can't do this work without our families and our communities. And then, of course, we're also hoping that over the course of 2 sessions, we hope that your understanding of what equity means in relationship to your work as a board becomes clearer to you, both as individuals and as a club. And so now that you know, now that you know what we're up to, I just want to ask, what are you hoping to get out of these sessions? And so I want to just give you a moment to think about that, and then I'd love to just hear you articulate, what is it that you're hoping to get out of this session? And the next. So I'll just open up the floor, and the first person who's ready, go ahead and speak. And and Dave is here too. Dave Murphy, we see you, and so feel free, please, to unmute yourself and chime in, because we don't want to miss your voice.
Okay.
What are you thinking you want to get out of this session tonight?
I know for me, I have done more of this in sessions previously, so maybe I've thought about it more. But I think for me right now, as I look at this, it's become most important to understand the environment that our schools are operating in right now, and to understand how all these current changes in society and what we're doing and how we perceive things, how we need to internalize that and operationalize it in our school system. And I think that's the biggest thing.
Thanks, Tim.
I'll go next. It's Meg. I think it's a personal journey. Governance as a board means that we have to find consensus. So tonight, I want to make sure, I want to hope that we move forward, and there isn't going to be any closure. It's a personal growth journey, but it'll help us to come together as a board and have a greater understanding of each other, and also our own personal journey as we move forward in working on through our biases and issues of our own person.
Meg, thank you so much. Anyone else want to share what they're hoping to get out of it? We'd love to hear your voices. Part of this is.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. I'm really excited about all the equity work that's begun over the last couple of years in our district, and that's continuing. And I'm really excited about tonight because I think that we have to be kind of modeling how we have these conversations and how we can be open-minded about learning together and being a better board, and kind of set a top-down model for our district. So I'm excited about that, and I'm particularly interested in the community buy-in piece when I look at what's happening around our state and around our country. And I want us to be a board that's prepared to have these conversations with our community and to get our community on board with the work that's happening in our district, because it's really powerful and good work.
Awesome. Thank you, Laurel.
This is Sharon. I think what I'm hoping to get out of this is just that we stop individually and as a group to think about how our decisions affect the community, and the ways in which the community might be affected that we hadn't thought of before, when we use an equity lens to consider how things have been, what we're looking to change, what we're looking to enact, or how we move forward. So I think it's important to kind of open our minds to consider different viewpoints on the work that we do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. Anyone else? Okay. Dave, did you want to share, or are you good?
I was just going to say greater understanding. Other than that, I'm good.
Okay, greater understanding. Got it. All right. So that's what we're hoping for. And we're going to continue to call on you, because this is really not just about a sit and get. This is really, as we said before, how we get to this place of greater understanding is through dialogue. And so we're really hoping that you'll feel really free to just engage in a back and forth dialogue with each other, but also with us. And so with that, I am going to pass the baton to my colleague, and she is going to get you started in your first point.
And Carrie's going to drive the slideshow bus, so I'm going to keep doing that. Hello, everyone. So we are going to jump right in with what grounds all of this work, because we're talking about how we govern for equity and also establishing why. And you've already established that a lot as you talked about what you want to get out of this evening. But we generally start by putting the district demographic data on the table. And that's a way of re-emphasizing the diversity in the community. And just sort of as this good visual image. And it also is a way of representing the importance in any equity work of disaggregating data. So showing data in terms of the different groups that are represented in the community. So this is the sort of foundational piece, this demographic data. And I'm going to pause and not talk about it in a few minutes, but I just want to say whenever you're looking at data like this, any data protocol would be sort of the first question is always thinking about what stands out in that data as you consider the demographics of the student population and the staff. And this is the most recent one we could get out of a profile and performance report, so it may be just a little bit different for 2021, or 21-22, excuse me. What stands out, and what are the implications of what stands out? And in your case, what are the implications for district governance? So those are the things you're thinking about. So I'm going to pause. I know you know this, but it's just a good time to re-familiarize yourself with the demographic data.
Do you want us to answer those questions? What we each
Not really, you're just doing
Okay.
that in your head. We're gonna have a conversation in a few minutes, just thinking about it, and thank you, because I was just about to go on. You're just considering those questions about what stands out. Hopefully you all received a PDF of the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to pull it up yourself, or you have the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to go back and take a look at this. We meant for you to have that for tonight, so you'll be able to look at it in more detail. But I'm going to ask Carrie to go on, because we are going to have a conversation. But I wanted to follow this tonight with a quotation from that we love to share with, particularly with boards of education. And this comes from Larry Leverett, who was a former superintendent in Connecticut, superintendent of the Greenwich Public Schools, also a superintendent in 2 other school districts before he became executive director of the Panasonic Foundation. And when he was the executive director, he wrote a piece that was part of a compilation on reading for equity. And he focused particularly on what he talks about, system change in government and school boards that lead for equity. And this was in 2016. It's still relevant today. So Larry Leverett said, boards that lead for equity will benefit from learning more about the complexity of system changes necessary to address matters of racial, socioeconomic, and cultural diversity within their communities and districts. They also benefit from seeking to understand how racism and other marginalizing practices affect access, opportunity, and outcomes. The ability to deal with matters of race, socioeconomic, language, and other factors, and build shared knowledge around cultural responsiveness informs policy development, resource allocation practices, systems of professional development, human resource approaches, and accountability policies and practices. He's kind of summarizing the role of the board. So I'd like you to take a minute to think about this quotation and think about the district demographic data that you just looked at. And so the first question on the table to begin a conversation about tonight is, what do these 2 pieces raise for you in terms of governing for equity in Portland? Both in terms of your personal role, but in the board's role writ large. I'll give you a minute to think, and then someone can just start.
This is Sharon. The first thing that jumped out at me was the fact that we have 1 non-white teacher in our entire school district. And I think that that's something that we need to look at in terms of how we change that. in terms of our policies, human resource approaches, all of those things. I think it's important that our kids see people like them in positions of authority and leadership, and we need to work on that.
I would speak to policy development. We want to make sure that the policies are equitable, particularly in the areas of truancy, behavior, dress codes, and other things, and other areas where we might have implicit bias just built into the policies and we don't realize it.
So I love that I'm hearing that you're talking about specific things that stand out that you are interested in moving forward on addressing related to equity. And so the demographic data certainly suggests that. It's just a starting point. It doesn't really, you do in fact have a very small number of people of color on your staff. And so I think that's you're already demonstrating sort of a proactive stance on what you want to try to govern for equity, right? So seeing things and saying, what do we do about that? And the same with policy. Anything else that people are thinking about as they think about this quotation from Larry Leverett, or as they thought about the data in terms of governing for equity?
Well, looking at the first line of his quote, I think it is important that we get a better understanding about the complexity of making system changes. I don't know that it's not top of mind how, what's built into this decision-making process, what could be considered something that would deter people from wanting to come here or work here or whatever. It's not a simple fix, and I think that that's something we need to consider more and really look at.
Right. And as a board, you're looking at the whole system. So in fact, when you're talking about human resources and staffing, when you're talking about policy, you are in fact thinking about system change, because all of those things have to do with the greater system. And it's not simple, as he said.
I also think professional development is critical, not only in the area of curriculum, but also in the professional development of the person. The equity work that was done last year and what was shared with teachers across the board. I think we can't overlook we can't say the cost is too high and we can cut back on that. That's really the essence of how we do change a system, is to do it one heart, one mind at a time. So professional development is also a critical part of that.
Right. And I think Larry's also talking about in terms of boards, when he uses the second sentence in the first paragraph about, it's a little sort of dogmatic in terms of telling boards, but he's saying they benefit from seeking to understand both racism and other marginalizing practices. When we're talking about equity, we're talking about identifying what students are experiencing inequities. Where are the inequities? And that can range for students of color, but it also can be something that students in other groups are experiencing. So understanding that, what are the marginalizing practices, that's really important. And that is about professional learning and building capacity, both for the boards, but also for the school systems, for the staff, which is, I think, what you were talking about.
What Sharon said earlier about looking at the complexity of system changes from the first sentence, and also kind of thinking about what you're just saying about understanding better how racism and other marginalizing practices are affecting our students. That's just really resonating for me right now, and it's bringing to mind a handful of very, anecdotal stories that I've heard from folks who have been really unhappy, kids who have been very unhappy with their experiences over the last many years, and have ended up choosing to leave the district to go elsewhere because they haven't felt like they've received the support that they've needed in district. And it's one thing to hear these stories and to feel kind of horrified that that's happening, and it's a very different thing to then think about as a board what are the system changes necessary, and what are the steps that we need to take, and how do we address this from a big picture. So I think that's kind of what it's making me think about.
Before I move on, is there any last comments or thoughts? Mary? So that is almost a perfect lead-in. If I had to plant you in here, I would do that, sort of like, what do we have to know? What do we have to do? How do we address things that are marginalizing students, that are creating inequities? And so the first piece on the table, which one of you already talked about tonight, is the application of an equity lens. And you're going to find out as we go on through the evening, you're going to hear from people in districts across the country, this notion of an equity lens is really critical for board members, for educators in all groups. So, I'm just going to say that our stance about an equity lens is what you're seeing in this slide, that to effectively address inequities and disparities requires that all decisions and structures and practices and outcomes are examined using an equity lens. I haven't described what an equity lens is, but we're saying you have to have equity consciously in your mind as you're examining that. As I saw some of you talking about when you were talking about the demographic data, right? You were thinking about where are there differences, where are there, you didn't see inequities in that, but just I'm applying an equity lens, I'm looking for some things that stand out that are notable in terms of differences that are there. So it means, in applying an equity lens, that you think about and examine everything with the intention of surfacing disproportionalities or disparities. Because those disproportionalities or disparities that you see in data or responses reflect inequities. Carrie? So this slide is sort of an overview of an equity lens and equity, achieving equity kind of writ large. And as I sort of foreshadowed before, we're going to go into more detail about what it means for a board to apply an equity lens. But writ large, the question that to achieve what you see in those bottom two frames, and those are graphic representations of equity, that is, all of the figures represented can see over the fence because they have the supports to be able to do that. And the final frame is called justice, which means there's no fence at all in front of them. So that's sort of a new dimension of this idea of that has been added to graphic representations of equity. And to achieve those, which we actually have in our Pledge of Allegiance, justice for all, to achieve those requires that we ask that sort of overarching question that's at the top of the screen. If we are in education, achieving educational equity requires that we're always asking, does what I'm doing, does this policy, does this plan, does this whatever, does this reinforce high expectations and eliminate inequities and barriers for each and every student? Does it? Will it? That's the intent. And that's sort of the overarching question in applying an equity lens, but the more specific pieces are played out on the right hand of the slide. So applying an equity lens means you're asking questions, why? So in terms of policy or decisions, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? Who's impacted by it and how? And broadly looking disaggregated, who's impacted by it and how? who or what is being valued or privileged by this decision, who's kept safe, who's going to reap the advantages of it, and who might be put at risk by this decision or policy or structure or plan. Whose voice or perspective or culture is represented in this, and whose is missing. Which has to do with who's at the table when they're created, right? How is this being done? And who has power as a result of it? Who does not? Who or what benefits? So those are big overarching questions. You're going to see different sort of variations of those questions over time, but they're the kinds of questions that kind of stream through your head. That's what it means to be applying an equity lens. That's what it means if you're going back and revisiting a policy. Why did we have this policy? Who was impacted by it? How were they impacted? Do we have data to show that? Which gets me to the last piece, which is in order to understand who's impacted, a huge, important characteristic of an equity lens is that you're disaggregating the information, the data that you're collecting to examine the impact of whatever decision or structure or practice you've made, you're engaged in. So you're kind of auditing your impact, but you're doing it by disaggregating data, whether you're a teacher in the classroom, whether you're creating an after-school program, whatever it is, you're disaggregating the impact data and looking for any disproportionality, again, because those reflect inequities. So the two big components we're saying that are part of an equity lens are you're running through some questions that are going to help you understand the impact, and then you're auditing the impact by using disaggregated data. So those are the big pieces. Before we go on and go into a little bit more detail, I just wonder if any of you have any questions about an equity lens sort of writ large, or any questions about sort of the stance that we put on the table that we at the center have.
If I could, I don't know if you can hear me. You can hear me okay? I just, looking at the equity lens, and I made my own note here, trying to just kind of wrap my head around the whole piece. And it really looks like what you're saying, in essence, is that any decision we make or any policy change or anything, it requires what I term as like a wholesome view, like an entirety view of like everybody that's going to impact, whether it's in an intentional way or unintentional way, whether it's purposely targeted, but to really dig down deep and understand those decisions. Is that pretty much it?
Yes, and sort of when we use lens, people think it's sort of a way of looking at it. It's actually a process. That's exactly, and it's a process with intentionality and putting equity at the forefront, right? So that you're recognizing you have population that's a certain way. You have data, you talked about anecdotal data of students' experiences here. You're going to have data about student outcomes. So we know that there are disparities in kind of impact things have had. So knowing that, you're proactively applying this to the work that you do going forward.
And so that kind of encompasses what the equity lens is, that we're developing that process to look at all of the things that we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I didn't catch that quite the first time I went through, and I still had in the back of my head what exactly the lens, and like you say, are we trying to distort something, or are we just trying to look really crisply at something? And it looks like it's the latter, is take a really crisp, stringent look at all of these actions that we take.
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I give long wait time. It's my practice of being a teacher. I'm just waiting. If you have anything, but I don't want to hold us here. But I'll wait another couple of 30 seconds if anybody has any observations or questions.
Patrice, can I just ask a question? It's not I'm asking a question that someone might think when they're looking at this. So if decisions are things that have to be made readily and that have to be made, you know, with efficiency and with expediency, then applying an equity lens to a decision-making process seems like it might slow down that process. So what might you say to someone who says, well, this is going to hamper our decision, our ability to make efficient, expedient decisions?
I would say that the people who are regularly using it, this becomes automatic, right? So right now, it's something that we're looking at, that we're saying we're going to begin to do, or that we want to think about, and it's still an abstraction. The more we, in education, and that's the sort of organization we're talking about here, but it could be done in business or anywhere else. The more we apply an equity lens, it's just an automatic filter as we're making the decision. And the commitment is that it become automatic and it doesn't necessarily slow things. I would say it isn't going to slow things down. Or if it does, I think you're making you're saying, well, to a greater good, right? To the fact that we don't want the impact to have a disproportional effect. We don't want to create inequities by making this decision. But the more you do it this way, the more you think about some of these questions in your head as you're making the decision, it shouldn't take longer. And I would say in terms of policy review or policy creation, you're going to hear from some board members and people working with boards later on tonight who will say, we're encouraging you to have a process that could make it last a little bit longer, could take a little bit more time, but I want you to think about that when we get to that tonight. So that's my immediate response. Carrie, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing that I would say is that, systemic transformation doesn't happen without shifting practices. And one of the most important practices I think we have to shift as policymakers and as practitioners is how we do the work. And so if it takes longer, I think you end up saving time on the other end of things, because if you're not reviewing your policies and asking yourselves how this is going to turn out, once those policies are enacted, you then again have the opportunity to say, okay, so how did this turn out? Did we end up creating a policy that is creating inequities, right? And so you can't, I don't think there's a way around it, right? Like you might, and so I think it's just an important conversation to have as a board to say, if we're really committed to this, then what are the things that we know we're going to have to change? And then how do we incorporate that into our culture, into our work culture, in a way that feels sustainable?
Yeah, I would just add to that too, if I could.
Please.
The work is going to be very difficult, and I might even describe it as grueling, because when you start doing this and being intellectually honest, inequities are everywhere, right? And I'll give you one example. The policy committee met yesterday and reviewed a statutory change that told us that we have to notify parents about how we weight courses and determine class rank at the Portland High School. Well, inherent in that is an inequity that precludes potentially special education students from ever being the class valedictorian based on how we weight courses. Now, the hard part of that is if we look at that through an equity lens, I think any one of us would go through this list and saying who's put at risk, who's in power, whose perspective and culture, who's being represented here, who's being empowered here. We would immediately say, holy cow, that's an inequitable approach. But the challenge that we have in front of us is to build the capacity in the district where when we have that conversation, it doesn't pack a board meeting with angry people saying you just want to get rid of class rank because of some agenda that you have. But we have to build that capacity to accomplish that. And that's grueling. That's going to be time-consuming and challenging, and we sort of have to be prepared that we have to build the capacity first before we just go change the policy. Does that make sense? And that's
No, it does.
everywhere. I
That-
mean,
that-
and that is all over all kinds of things that we just have to go into this with eyes wide open.
Is that something we're actually going to do? We're eliminating classes?
No, right? So like but
Oh,
that's.
That was
that's-
the
that
conversation.
was the
Conversation
conversation.
was how do we,
Yeah.
how
Well, I
do we
mean,
start
that's-
taking
yeah.
steps towards a more
Yeah.
equitable practice
Right.
in class rankings and move towards something that is fairer for our students.
Yeah, and the answer is right now, no.
Well, it wouldn't be.
Yeah, we haven't built the capacity to accomplish pure equity, right? To get to that justice frame there, which might mean no more class rank. But what we're starting down the road towards here is, and I see Eric is a high school person, years of institutionalized cultural inequity that we have to recognize for what it is. But then it's going to be a process of building capacity within the community. So when we talk about these things, we do it in a way that moves us forward and doesn't detract.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of the notion, Karen, Patrice, I know this is something we've talked about, of evolution, not revolution.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
There it is. Thank you. Excellent.
That's it.
Maybe there's a time and a place for both.
Well.
But, yeah, I mean, for me, though,
But I hear
that's the scariest, I mean, that's like the worst scenario. If we're going to come to a point where we're going to, I mean, everybody knows there's going to be some people who are going to do better than others.
Right.
And to say that we would just no longer acknowledge that or have any celebration of exceptionalism, to
Interesting.
kneel at the, of saying, well, that's a level that gets into like science fiction books of, like, well, nobody can excel because not everybody can excel.
Sure. It's
I don't,
a-
Well,
that's not what Charles is saying.
No, but
That's a
just
conversation
that
for
example,
another day.
that's what made me think of is, I think that, that's,
Well, this is a discussion for the policy committee, once we have our equity lens to do that. But-
well, the equity ones
Yeah,
is,
well, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, point taken. Thank you,
Yeah.
Charles. I was thinking of the same thing as we were talking about policy.
Right, and that only was on the top of my mind because we just talked about this in the policy
Yesterday,
committee
yep.
yesterday. And absolutely, there's no suggestion, and I don't even know that I would even support it on face value right away until we develop our equity lens and build the capacity for that kind of
Absolutely.
potential change to happen. But I love the way Eric describes it, is it's going to be evolution, and it's going to be the hard work we have ahead of us.
But isn't, and maybe I'm missing something, isn't this our equity lens that we're looking at right here? These questions and drilling down? So when we talk about developing is there something in addition to this, another layer of equity lens that we're going to be taught? I'm just confused.
To Charles's point, to enact that is grueling, right? It's,
Well, it
those
takes more
seem-
time. It
Yeah,
takes
but while those seem
thoughtfulness
like,
and-
well, depending on if you're looking at it, they may seem like easy questions to ask and to analyze an issue through. To get into that work is difficult, and to Charles's point, inequities exist everywhere. I'm going to butcher this quote, Carrie, but I know we've used it a lot. Where there is discretion, there will be discrimination.
Yep.
Like, it's something to that effect, right? So I think the idea is, once we start to uncover or surface one inequity, it leads to the next, it leads to the next, it leads to the next, because we've been existing in perpetuity without an equity lens. So the minute we begin to apply it, it's like everything comes to light that we've not previously seen, and it becomes a chain reaction. And that's part of what makes the work grueling. And to go back to the quote you put up around from Larry Leverett, it speaks to that need to continually be learning, to continually come back to that shared knowledge and that shared commitment, because it's endless.
Well, it's like any management process, right? You always have to come back to that assessment phase to see, are we still holding true to what we're trying? It's not, we've been through many of these types of things. I think it's nice that we see the similarities and with other projects that we've done to try and make decisions that are more appropriate
And
for
I
everybody.
guess I would remind everybody that we will have data. It will not be opinion. It will not be, it will not be what we think or what we think we know. It'll be actual data that we will use to make that equity lens, to go through that equity lens and make that process very real.
So what I heard is, Charles, you were beginning to apply an equity lens by saying, oh my, this policy may have this impact. Then the second piece, as I just heard you talk about, is looking at data, is that you need to have data to find out if that is in fact impact. The equity lens, enacting it, is a process, and its first process is raising the questions and saying, this appears to, in the case of this particular policy, this appears to eliminate that possibility for a whole group of students. So if that's the case, we have to find out, in fact, is that the case? And then you have next steps as a result. But the equity lens is what you're applying to say, we're committed to equity, so we're going to take on these questions. And you just demonstrated that.
Yeah, and the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, that's what I just did. And right away, you start to feel how difficult it is, because sometimes asking the questions is difficult, and looking at the data is difficult, because it starts to reveal things that have been long-standing practices and traditions and norms that we all grew up with, that reflect our inherent biases, that reflect a state of the world that should make us uncomfortable. I mean, one of the things we read at the beginning was lean into your discomfort, right? And that's just one, and it only came to mind because it was less than 24 hours ago that we were talking about it, right? And certainly how we talk about it, how we address it, and how we come to decisions, I think absolutely can be informed by these questions.
Absolutely, sure, yeah.
I'll just say too, Laurel, you laughed and said maybe there's space for both, right? Evolution and revolution. Part of the grueling nature of this work is we may uncover something that points to a potential inequity that we then investigate. And when we find out that, yes, this is an actual inequity that we are advancing until we make repair to the policy or practice, making repair to that policy or practice is not easy. It's not something that we just, okay, change it, right? Make the change. The public may not be ready for it. Our students, our staff, our families may not be ready for it. So while we need the time to make that repair, we're also aware that students continue to suffer under that inequity, which within itself is a grueling acknowledgement that as long as that inequity exists and we need the time to repair it, the injustice related to that inequity will continue. And that's a really weighty reality.
And some of it is based on systemic racism and other things that we don't have any control over. And the state is mandating certain things, but they're not using an equity lens when they are mandating certain changes in our policies or in what we do. So it's going to be one heart and mind at a time.
So
I think that's a perfect lead into what Carrie was going to have to say about sort of why those things are deeply ingrained in what the state is asking you to do or what you're asking to do. So I think, Carrie, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm mostly conscious of the time. I'm not trying to stop conversation, but maybe that seems like a good lead in to me.
Yeah, it's a perfect lead-in, and I'm just very, impressed with the vocabulary that you already are using to engage in this conversation about this idea of an equity lens, why we need one. And so I'm gonna talk about this idea of socialization, right? I think it's one of the ways that is really helpful for us to think about, why we react and respond to things the way that we do is because we've been socialized, right, to value certain things, and this is really important. And so I want to just take a step back. We're gonna show you a video in a minute, and what the purpose of kind of engaging in this next level of conversation is to kind of double click on some of the things that you've already talked about, right? So several of you said around the Larry Leverett quote, that he did. He named the importance of seeking to understand how racism and other marginalizing practices affect access, opportunities, and outcomes in order to be a board that leads for equity. So I'm a career educator, and I very rarely encounter blatantly racist educators in my profession, right? But I have, in my 30 years, encountered the impact of bias, right? My own bias and the bias of others. It's a very powerful marginalizing practice that can work against our very best intentions. And so one of the ways that I think it's helpful to think about biases and where they come from, and why they're so present in our interpersonal interactions and are reinforced so vehemently in our educational institutions, is to recognize the influence and the power of our socialization, both individually, so personally, but also at a professional level. Because what you're talking about, right, this valedictorian, that's a sacred cow, right? That's a big deal. There are some things in education that they are, they're untouchables, right? But are they in service of all of our students? And so we've been socialized to value certain things, both on a personal level and an organizational level. And this is really, really, really important when we're applying an equity lens, because we will rock that boat, right? We will rock that boat. And so I just want to quickly talk through these points on the slide and then move us into a video where we're going to listen to Jennifer Eberhardt talk a little bit more about bias. And so just this idea that we develop our ideas about people in terms of their race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, ability, and citizenship from the culture that surrounds us, okay? And if you are part of that dominant culture, that has a very powerful influence versus if you are part of a more marginalized or a typically minoritized culture. We create categories that make sense to us, right? They help us make sense of what's around us. And to be clear, our categorizations are not neutral, right? We've all heard about this at the in-group, out-group, right? Us, them, right? We are socialized to perceive and value these categories differently. So this is important because this happens to us almost without our conscious knowledge, right? We are flooded by messages depending on the shows that we listen to, the books that we read, the magazines we subscribe to, the newspapers we select, the columns we even read in those newspapers, the institutions that we go to, where we find ourselves, our neighborhoods, our families, right, our schools, our jobs, all of our higher ed institutions, all of these places are places where we are socialized with messaging, okay? And those messages mean a lot to us because they've come to inform who we are and how we are. And this next piece is really important. Countless studies show that we actually can't be objective. We talk about this idea of being objective. It's really difficult to be independent from our socialization about one another. Message received, loud and clear. The socialization causes us to discriminate, but it's mostly not conscious, right? So this is a really important concept to hold in our heads, this idea of socialization, and why we think the way we think, how we think the way we think. And if we don't hit the pause button, we could find ourselves perpetuating, advocating for practices and policies that maintain inequity. Okay? So, Jennifer Eberhardt, a professor of psychology at Stanford University, has done extensive research on unconscious bias in courtrooms, in boardrooms, prisons, classrooms, and she walks us through what unconscious bias is and how it shows up in all of us and what we can do to interrupt it. Okay? So I'm making this case here that our biases actually are a product of our socialization, of our socialized worldview. Okay? So as you watch this video, I want you to think about your own experiences with bias and the ways in which it shows up, both personally and professionally. So I know we're pivoting a little bit. We've been talking about this idea of an equity lens. This video will help you understand the rationale for why we need it. and what it helps us do. So I'm going to just stop the share for a second so that I can get this video going. So just give me 2 clicks. I always say, I'm always about 2 clicks away from what I need to be able to do. I'm going to share my sound, and hopefully you will all be able to hear this beautifully.
Some years ago, I was on an airplane with my son, who was just 5 years old.